terrible tragedy of President Garfield's assassination in 1881 shattered his wife Lucretia's world. First lady for only 4 months, she was suddenly thrust into the spotlight during his suffering after the shooting, staying constantly by his side. She was admired and respected by her fellow Americans and people abroad, and she publicly exhibited strength and courage. However, her shy and private nature resumed after her husband's death when she returned to Mentor, Ohio. Through her own words, we will learn more about Lucretia Garfield's dedication to her husband's memory and discover how she occupied her remaining 36 and a half years. The widow Garfield, at the turn of the 20th century, will explain how her children achieved their own destinies and why James said that Lucretia rose up to every occasion. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Mrs. Lucretia Garfield.
Thank you very much for joining me this lovely May afternoon in 1911. And I'm so pleased to see so many of my friends and family and neighbors here today. I'm sure that many of you have not heard much about me since that terrible tragedy. And I admit, I have ducked all publicity. For you see, I feel I am not personally famous. My husband was well known, and his name, Garfield, is a famous name. But I'm just a woman who was devoted to her husband and family. Even the newspapers have started calling me the vanishing first lady and discreet creep. So I am pleased to be joining you today in my parlor. It's a wonderful day to be back in Mentor, Ohio. I have just returned from my winter home in Pasadena, California. I heard a few weeks ago there was a terrible snowstorm here, so I delayed my return to my Mentor farm just a few weeks. You see, it's better for my health to head out to the warmer climate every winter, and I'm pleased to be back here now to see all of my familiar friends and family. Perhaps you don't know too much about my family, but you do know about my husband's assassination and his very brief presidency, which did draw me into the spotlight. Some people called his funeral the funeral of the century. And I was very touched by such an outpouring of grief from around the world, as well as just here in Ohio and around the country. One of the most kind and generous acts was the formation of a subscription fund to help my children and I continue on after my husband's death. Many of you, I know, contributed to that fund, sending what you could to help us. It raised over $360,000. I can never repay all of you and thank you enough for your generosity. Even Queen Victoria sent a beautiful wreath, which is now preserved and saved in my memory room in the Memorial Library of the house. Could it be that that was 30 years ago already? I have not minded growing old, as I told Mrs. Coyle, but to have old age fashion its grip upon me is another thing. But I do have some good memories in between all of the sadness that was in our lives. Some of you may not know that I purchased a home in Cleveland about a year after my husband's assassination. Are you familiar with the Worthington House? It was at Prospect and about 40th Street. And this was a very good place to move and relocate because my daughter Molly was enrolled at Miss Middleberger's school. She attended along with former President Hayes' daughter Fanny and some of the other young ladies on Millionaires Row. So it was an ideal location, and it was quite close to some of my Mason family as well. Now the younger boys were tutored at home during part of that time. This was Irvin and Abram. and the older boys were off at Williams College, their father's alma mater. So you see, we took care of the education of all of these children because after my husband's death, I had 3 missions that I thought were the most important. One was raising those 5 children, the youngest of which was 8 and the oldest was 18 when their father passed away. The second thing was to keep this farm going and to upgrade things where necessary. The third was to keep my husband's memory alive, not just for my young family, but also for any friends and visitors that also came to my home. So that money that was raised for that subscription fund came in very handy. While I was living in my home in Cleveland, I hired Forrest Coburn, a wonderful architect from Cleveland, to help me design a library, a fitting memorial to my husband who loved to read, sometimes 3 to 4 books a week, all different subjects. We had books everywhere. Any of our visitors know they were stacked on the floor, they were on tables, they were throughout the house. So my idea was to create a library where we could house many of the books and to preserve my husband's papers. So Forrest Coburn came up with a lovely design, and I was assisted by my husband's secretary, Joseph Stanley Brown, who said that I must find a fireproof place for my husband's papers. So during 1885 and 86, about 5 years after my husband's death, the Memorial Library Edition was added to the back of the farmhouse that my husband knew and loved. And being in Cleveland, it was easy to let the workers take apart the house, including the kitchen. You ladies, I'm sure, can relate to that situation. There was no way to live in that house with the kitchen torn apart. So the home in Cleveland made it just that much easier for us. In the spring of 1886, I sold the Worthington house, moved back here to the Mentor Farm with that lovely new addition on the back of the house. And my children, the timing couldn't have been more perfect for that library to be completed because my children were now getting older and some of them were getting ready to be married. My 2 oldest boys, Harry and Jimmy, had gone on to Columbia Law School, and they had just passed the bar in 1888 when Molly, my daughter, decided to get married. Some of you may know that when she was 15, she wrote in her diary, "I believe I'm in love." And the object of her affection was her father's secretary, Joseph Stanley Brown, who was 9 years older than Molly. Nothing happened when she was 15, but when Molly and I returned from a grand tour of Europe, who was standing on the dock? Joseph Stanley Brown with an engagement ring. They planned a summer wedding for June in 1888, not long after that beautiful library was completed. And it ended up being a double wedding because my oldest son, Hal, married Belle Mason on the same day. The house was festooned with flowers. It looked like a church throughout the house. The library was fixed up especially nice for the wedding, with each couple taking their vows in front of the bay window. A string quartet played the wedding march from Lohengrin. And a lovely reception was held for our 100 guests downstairs in the reception hall and dining room. Now I had made all of the guests promise me not to talk about the wedding because, you see, I felt, as I mentioned earlier, that my husband was famous, not his children. This was to be their private day. And Molly had her attendants using pink colors. Belle had yellow, one bride after the other taking their vows and then enjoying their reception afterwards. The guests were transported back to Cleveland by train. But the next morning, in the Cleveland Leader, there were all types of details about this wedding. So some of you guests spoke to the reporters on the train. but it was a lovely way to start off that beautiful library. With 2 new married couples in the family. My second son, Jimmy, who we've taken to calling him Jim now that he's an older man, met Helen Newell of Chicago, and they married in December of 1890 in Chicago. So by the turn of the century, I had quite a few children already married and starting families of their own. My young son, Abe, a wonderful architect, married Sarah Williams of the Sherwin-Williams families. And they married in Bracknell in a wonderful ceremony there in 1897. So you see, by 1900, most of my children were well on their way to a happy family life of their own. Except for the old Dutch brig, our Irvin McDowell. He always was an independent soul, and he marched to his own drummer. When the 3 older boys all wanted to go into law, 2 of them went to Columbia, but Irvin, the 3rd one, went to Harvard Law School. So he made his own destiny further east rather than here in Cleveland, joining the law firm with Bentley Warren, a son who was a friend of my husband's. And Irvin was a bachelor for quite a long time. He was the last to marry. He did not get married to Susan Emmons until 1906. So he definitely had his own thoughts and his own path to follow. Around the turn of the century, my daughter-in-law Helen and I had this wonderful idea. Actually, it was Helen's idea to consolidate all of our family properties. Because by that point, I had one son living east of me at a home called East Lawn. This was Hal and Belle Mason's house with Belle's mother and her family. On the west side of the property, a little bit northwest of my house, my son Jim and Helen built a lovely 35-room house. It was bigger than my house. In fact, they started to call my house the old house at that point. But Helen and Jim built a lovely home in Mrs. Alvord's Grove, a piece of property that my husband had wanted to purchase and develop, but we never got the chance. Now, Jim and Helen had some family of their own, but Helen suggested, let's hire a landscape architect, and we can consolidate all of these properties that the family owned east to west, almost 400 acres. And once the architect designed pathways and driveways into our various properties, we could come in from Manor Avenue and would never have to go back out onto it to go to each other's houses. There were ways to walk, there were trails and pathways and driveways. I guess we had a lovely family compound that stretched quite a ways along the avenue here. Still a dirt road at that time, but the interurban came in along with electricity along the south side of the avenue. They even put a stopping place in front of my farmhouse, Stop 55 on the interurban. So I know many of you have used that to come out to visit me over the years. Made a very handy place to get off of the train to come and see me. My life, in the meantime, as my children got older, has been very social but quiet, which is why you have not heard about me. I have had a number of interests. Are you aware that Molly and I helped start a ladies' literary club here in Lake County? In 1898, we had the idea to start a group where women could talk about important subjects, not just meet for coffee or for sewing, just like the men's groups were doing. And Molly came up with the name Miscellany Club because she thought it wouldn't tie us down to anything in particular. So my sister-in-law, Liddy, was the first president of the club. We kept the membership very small so that we could meet in each other's parlors. And we chose a subject for each year that we met, like American history. And each lady took a turn researching a subject on that topic and then would present it at our meetings. And it was a wonderful way to get all the ladies of this area involved in reading and talking about important subjects, not just some trivial things that we ladies have often been delegated to or relegated to, I guess. And then some of you may know that my family's instrumental in helping to start the Mentor Library. The library started as a lending institution that was in the city hall. But when it came time for the library to have its own building, they had raised enough money. The property was purchased on the northeast corner of Center Street and the Avenue. And my son Jim was on the board of that library. I even held some functions in the house to raise money. I donated books and a piano to get the library started. And we would have dime socials, raising more funds for additional books. And when it came time for the first permanent building to be built on that northeast corner, who do you think my son Jim hired as the architect? His brother Abram. And that building was a very charming stone building that served and still serves its purpose just beautifully. For I love books as much as my husband. I love to read. It would be like stopping to breathe without having books. Now, I've also gone to the opera in New York for the season and made travels to the east and west coast to visit grandchildren. I've tried to keep the family very close to one another. When the little ones were first born, I would send them letters and from their grandmama and talk about their cousins and invite them all to our Mentor farm here, to Lawnfield, as the neighbors and reporters called it, for the summer so that they could all gather together and enjoy the companionship of their cousins. It's a very big family now because the 5 children had 16 children. So there are quite a few young ones to carry on the name and keep the property in nice shape, I hope, as we go through the future. I also, as I mentioned, have started to head out to South Pasadena for the winters. You see, Molly and her Mr. Brown moved out there, and that was a good place for me to visit for a while. And some of the railroads had built some wonderful hotels that we ladies from northeastern Ohio would stay at when we first went out there. But I wanted a home of my own. So in 1903, I hired a distant cousin, 2 cousins actually, Green and Green, some famous arts and crafts architects, to design a home for me in South Pasadena on Buena Vista Street. It looks like a lovely Swiss chalet. I think some of you have been there in person. I know I've gotten a letter from the Finks to tell me about that house and their visit there. It's a beautiful house that was perfect for a winter home. Ideally, a place where the ladies from here would put their automobiles on the train and we would take our drivers and head out west for the bad weather season here in Ohio. So I have just returned to this area to enjoy your lovely spring and summer and to invite my big family here over the summer to enjoy the property as well. I couldn't be more proud of my children. They are all wonderful, upstanding citizens in their own right, in spite of the huge tragedy in their lives. My oldest son, Hal, is now the president of Williams College, their father's alma mater and the alma mater of all 3 boys. Second son, Jim, was very much close to Theodore Roosevelt over the years and served on the Civil Service Commission and was his Secretary of Interior just a few years ago. Irvin is serving on the boards of hospitals in Boston. He does love to golf. for his relaxation. And Abe has been president of the Architects Association and is very instrumental in this area in creating lovely buildings, some of which you might be aware of. I understand there's a place called Legacy Village now that has one of Abram's buildings sitting on that property. And there are many others here in Lake County. At the Lake Erie Seminary in Painesville, the music hall was created by my son. Molly married her Mr. Brown and has 3 children, and she has been a traveling mother along many paths. She even lived in Alaska for a while, and as I mentioned, has been in California. I think she may settle down in Washington or New York one day. You know, I sent her off to finishing school in Connecticut, Miss Porter's. Have some of you used that for your young ladies as well in your family? Well, that worked out to be a very good idea until I realized that that was too close to Yale's scientific school, where Mr. Brown was going to college. And I thought it was best to retrieve Molly and take her on the grand tour instead. So I know that you ladies can relate to some of the things that I've been through with my children as well. As I say, I couldn't be more proud of my children. They have been a joy and an inspiration to me. And with the memory of my dear husband and our little ones who didn't stay with us very long, I can say that I have had a remarkable life. For does not life grow richer as we grow older? Even our losses lead us into wider fields and nobler thoughts. Thank you very much for joining me today. So pleasantly surprised to see all of your wonderful faces here, my friends and neighbors. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions if that's suitable for our time frame on any subject. Yes, ma'am.
What kind of renovations did you oversee?
Here at the Benner Farm? Yes, well, there have been a number over the years. First of all, the Memorial Library Edition, which was quite a feat in itself, added almost another third of a house to the farmhouse. Also, we found natural gas here on the property. Some of the neighbors up the road had found that and had a well dug, and I thought that might be likewise here on our property, if you know the way gas is in pockets. And sure enough, we did have natural gas here on the property. So in 1883, I had a well dug for that and a gas holder built to regulate the gas. Now, Mr. Garfield and I always had difficulty with water here on the property. So I also had a newly dug well for water and a beautiful windmill built over that well. You may have passed it on your visit here today. I didn't want just an ordinary steel frame windmill. I wanted something a little bit different that could be a landmark, a feature for my farm property here. So that was built in 1894. The building you're sitting in was built in 1893. An additional spot for horses as well as carriages. So we have a horse barn out back, but this was a carriage house. And you may look around and see some fancy eyebrow windows up above you. I didn't want it to just be an ordinary carriage house. So there have been a number of things over the years to keep busy with here. You all know in running a household and running a farm that it takes upkeep and upgrading. Another question, yes, sir?
What's the origin of the term Lawnfield?
Oh, Lawnfield, yes. Well, maybe some of my neighbors could answer that better than I, because Mr. Garfield and I were surprised to find out that people were calling our farm Lawnfield. We just called it our Mentor Farm. But I think it was a play on words, the name Garfield, and the visitors during the campaign time were often in the lawn area of the house, in front of the house. And I think the reporters and our neighbors thought we needed something a little more sophisticated or fancy than just a nature farm. So that's how that came about. And Mr. Garfield and I, as I say, we read about it in the newspapers. But soon, it sounded like a good name. It has a catchy name to it, doesn't it? So we started to order stationery with that on there. Yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering if the money that was raised to help you out afterwards, did that last you for your lifetime?
It's been good so far here to 1911. Luckily, that money was put into a trust fund in New York, and so I receive a certain amount of it every year, and that's what helps me continue to live here and to have raised those children. Yes, so far, that's working out very well. I was also lucky because Congress finally appropriated a pension for former presidents' wives. After my husband's death, 1882, we started to receive $5,000 a year. Yes, ma'am.
I was curious if the money that was raised was the same lump of money that was used for the monument at downtown in the cemetery.
I'm very pleased to say that my friends and people around Ohio especially were generous a second time. That was a separate subscription fund that was raised for the Garfield Monument at Lakeview Cemetery. And we dedicated that in May of 1890 on Memorial Day, Decoration Day. I am so touched by the generosity of this community and our state of Ohio. School children collected money and sent money in for that wonderful monument. So that was a separate subscription in addition to the money that was given to the family. Quite remarkable. Yes, ma'am?
What advice would you give to future First Ladies?
Oh, future First Ladies. Well, I may not be good at giving advice because I was terribly intimidated by the idea of becoming First Lady. Even though I'd been a congressman's wife for quite a few years and had lived in Washington, but I knew how difficult it was going to be with reporters watching every word that you said, people scrutinizing your wardrobe, people talking about what day you had held your open houses in the White House. And luckily, Mrs. Blaine, the wife of the Secretary of State, took me under her wing and gave me some valuable advice. But I would say to watch what you say is number one. I know that my husband told me once that he never felt embarrassed by anything that I had said. So I would say that's the number one thing. And number two is to keep your family life as normal as possible while you're living in the White House. Irvin was riding his bicycle down the stairs. We had some moments that were quite frightening there. Molly walked to school just up the road from the president's mansion. So we tried to keep life as normal as possible within that time. Other questions? Yes?
Could you tell me, do you remember the age of your oldest son when you got married? You said he waited a long time.
Well, that was the third son. That was Irvin, who didn't get married until 1906. And he was born in 1870. 1870. Right. You know that I'm 79, right? Yes. Miss Mary is looking him up. But he was born in 1870. Is that not right, my Garfield friends? Yes. I start to lose track. And so he was 36, was he not?
Close to 40.
Yes. Yes, and he had 3 children after that, too. 2 daughters and a son. So they were quite the late bloomers. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering if you had any health issues that,
I have had some, sir.
and what
Yes.
triggered your demise.
I think this gentleman has the gift of second sight. I do have some maladies that I have dealt with since I was a young girl. Many of us that lived here in the Western Reserve caught malaria or the ague, which was very debilitating. And I've had lung problems in the wintertime, as I mentioned. And so going west, where it's warmer climate and a little bit more suitable for my health, has helped me, I think, as I've aged. But if we could look ahead, I would imagine something like pneumonia might be the thing that grasps me and takes me off this planet.
Yes,
Was your farm a dairy farm?
this farm has been a farm that took care of our family quite well. We have vegetable gardens, we have things planted for the animals here, we have dairy cows as well as beef cattle. You parked in the chicken yard, so you will have to move your carriages from there. We do have pigs as well. A nice turkey for Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner periodically. And some apple and peach orchards. Any of the excess butter that we made from the dairy cow's milk, we sold in Painesville. But after my husband's demise, I did sell off about 30 acres north of the railroad tracks to consolidate the farm a bit. But I do have my son Jim helping me keep this farm in good shape. And it was his suggestion to upgrade the beef cattle to a better breed. So it's quite a good farm.
This is probably-
Yes, sir, this gentleman has all the probing
This is a
questions.
safer question.
Oh.
Did you learn how to drive?
I have refrained from even attempting that, sir. I do have a driver. I know some of the other ladies have been a bit more bold. And my brother Joe, who's 10 years younger, he would encourage me to do such a thing because he also would like to go up in an airplane. But I have avoided that at all costs, sir. So I have a driver who will take me to church along the avenue and who will put the car on board the train and go with me out to California. I'm not quite so brave to attempt that at my age. Would you suggest learning to drive?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you go to a church around
Yes, the
here?
Disciples of Christ Church, that's right at Jackson and Mentor Avenue. The Mentor Christian Church, I think it says on the sign. Yes, that was our home church, if you want to call it that. But Mr. Garfield and I have been in so many churches over our relationship, over our marriage, and in Washington as well.
Where is Williams College that your son attended?
Oh, Williams College is in Williamstown, Massachusetts, which is almost at the border of New York and Massachusetts. I would say a bit of a distance from Troy, New York, if you know where that is. It's a very picturesque area with mountains and yes, I have visited a number of times for the commencement exercises over the years. And I have a grandson who graduated from there as well, while my son Hal was the president of the school. Did I have suitors?
After, you know, that you're a widow, a rich
Well,
widow.
I have not remarried, but there are a few gentlemen that come calling out in Pasadena. They come for a lovely cup of tea and some good conversation. So I'm not lonely in that regard for company. But I have no interest in remarrying. Things were just going so wonderfully when Mr. Garfield was taken from us. We were married 22 years. Some of you know that we had a lot of difficulty in the early years of our marriage, but everything had worked out so beautifully, and our children were getting older, and Mr. Garfield and I were able to go to the literary club in Washington and attend the theater and do some things, you know, that we adults can do when our children get old enough to take care of themselves.
How long did President Garfield's mother live with you?
Oh, she's asking about my mother-in-law, Eliza Garfield. How long did she live with me? Well, she moved here with us in 1876, well, sort of the next spring, actually, we moved in. And she lived till January of 1888. So she was here 7 more years after the president's death. And I have to say, she wrote some wonderful letters to family about me, about how well Mr. Garfield and I took care of her. and how nice her room was here. And she would write about missing me when I was away from the property. So that's a very nice thing to remember about Eliza, because I know most of you have seen her portrait and you think her too severe, and she did have a sharp tongue. But I think she knew that I was quite the defender of her son James, just as she was. So we could see eye to eye on that. Yes, ma'am.
Just curious, where were you raised, and where was Mr. Garfield raised?
Yes, well, if we had not gone to the same school, the same academy, we would have never met. Because I'm a Garrettsville girl. I was born in Portage County, and I was the oldest of 4 children. Mr. Garfield was born in Orange Township, quite a bit east of Garrettsville, in Cuyahoga County, and he was the baby of the family. So we had quite different experiences growing up. My father was a carpenter and a farmer, so he always had some type of work, and our life was a bit more comfortable than Mr. Garfield's, whose father had died when he was only 18 months old. So they had much more of a struggle than our family did. And we crossed paths at the crossroads in Chester. I have friends here from there today. And went to the Geauga Seminary, which was much like a high school nowadays. And we were in the same class together, just classmates at that time. We each were enamored with other people then. So we did both go on to college and cross paths there for a second time in Hiram. So that's when we took a different interest in one another.
Yes, sir.
Did your husband know Platt R. Spencer? Your husband sent some letters to him and praised his teaching at the Eclectic
Yes, are you from
Society.
Ashtabula, sir?
I'm from Madison.
All right, well, not too far from that area. Yes, we do know the Spencers, and Mr. Garfield did take some Spencerian handwriting classes himself in order to teach others so he could raise some money for school. And we do know the Spencers quite well. I'm glad to hear about Platt and his family. Yes, ma'am?
We are board members of the Platt R. Spencer Historical Society.
Well, very lovely to have you here with us.
To know about the connection between President Garfield and Platt R. Spencer.
And you know my husband was left-handed, correct?
No.
He was left-handed, so can you imagine him learning that fancy handwriting as a left-handed person, probably being taught by everyone that was right-handed, and then him going on to teach it as well. So quite interesting to think about that. But yes, we have quite a connection, our family, to the Spencers. Yes? What did I study in college? I wanted to be a teacher, so I had a very classical education, and it was the same as Mr. Garfield's, believe it or not. The same difficult coursework that he took. I also was enrolled in Greek and Latin and literature and mathematics and philosophy and the natural sciences and languages, a little bit of French. And of course we had chapel every morning. But it was, singing school was one of my favorites too. Mr. Garfield enjoyed that too, although I have to admit he does not have a voice that's the best of singers. My coursework was very difficult. We had to read in Greek and Latin and then translate those readings. So it prepared me to be a very good teacher, however. And I enjoyed my reading class especially in my school in Cleveland, the Brownell School. That was my favorite class to teach. But you know what happens when you get married? You're not a teacher any longer. Now you're a mother and a wife, and you take care of your household. So I had to give that up at that point. But I did, although I guess I used it with my own children, did I not? Thank you for that question.
Another question.
One more question, yes.
How many people did it take to keep Lawnfield running smoothly?
How many people did it take to keep Lawnfield running smoothly? Well, in reality, when Mr. Garfield was alive, we often couldn't afford a lot of help, and we needed a lot of help outside with the farming. But as we could afford to, and as we could find good help, because you know, ladies, that's the other difficulty, is being able to find good help, we would hire some girls from Mentor Village to come in and help with cooking and cleaning. Some of them were Irish immigrants. As I'm getting older, though, I'm finding that I need more assistance on a regular basis. And so I do have a couple of people that I've hired that have a spot, a room to be housed here at Lawnfield. It's much easier to do it that way. I've been able to get some wonderful recommendations from my friends and neighbors here for some good workers. Anyone else? Thank you very much for your very probing questions and thoughtful questions. I appreciate you joining me today. I know by looking into the future that 1911, this was not Mother's Day, because Mr. Wilson is the one who created Mother's Day on May 9th of 1914. So if I could look ahead, I would say Happy Mother's Day to all of you ladies in the audience. Thank you.
I want to thank you also for coming out today. If you want a tour of the home, we have one starting at 2 o'clock, and you just may have Lucretia Garfield as your guide, so that'd be a whole lot of fun. I also want to introduce Tim Garfield, who's a great-great-grandson. If we have Lucretia, we've got to also, of course, introduce Tim. Well, come see him. And his wife, Tim is a descendant of Jim, the second son, and a great friend to Lawnfield. So thank you for coming.
Garfield National Historic Site.
And does he not look like a relative? You can see the genes have carried on quite well.
And it is true that almost every tour, do descendants come ever visit the home? Well, first ask how many descendants, and
20, 25. Immediate area.
Yeah, in the immediate area, but overall, there's close to 500, perhaps, descendants of James and Lucretia Garfield. So, the 5 children.
Oh my,
Mrs.
we
Garfield
really
had-
started something.
Oh, very much so. Okay, there's punch and cookies in the back. If you didn't have a cookie or a glass of punch, by all means, go ahead and partake. And also, if you'd like a tour of the house, you can go right out the door here and talk to the woman at the front desk. Thank you all. And thank you. Appreciate
Yes, for sure. It's one of the few times you don't have to serve them. And so you need to let someone wait on you. You know, let someone wait on you.
I love the dress and the outfit that Lucretia's wearing is just gorgeous.
Thank you.